Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome to Proc-N-Roll, your guide to practical procurement, where we make procurement rock and roll. Conrad Smith is with me, the innovator, the 30 years in procurement, Intel, Adobe, and the founder and CEO of the coolest and hottest startup, Graphite, and Zach Bashir, my go-to person whenever I have any procurement question that nobody can answer. So thank you for listening to us. Thank you for seeing us. We are continuing the conversation we started last week on orchestration in procurement. Oh my God, you guys should have seen and listened the feast fight, the virtual feast fight that happened between us as we were preparing to this episode. These brilliant minds that I'm working with, they have tons of ideas, and I keep dragging them back to practical solutions. Tell me how it will happen for my procurement peers. What will procurement manager do after they finish listening and watching our episode? So we are very excited to keep drilling on this subject, to keep double clicking on what is orchestration in procurement. So as we were preparing to the episode, we actually went in length in discussing, is orchestration an intake? Is intake becoming an orchestration? I think the only thing that we agreed that intake has to exist, but in what form and how it reflects or replaces or duplicates orchestration, that is the first point to debate. Conrad, please start sharing your perspective on the subject.
Yeah. So, the question, what is intake? What is orchestration? I would say it really, to me, they're sort of part of the same thing. If you think of any process that you're going to be running in the business, you need an intake mechanism into that process. And, before technology, that intake might have been a phone call or a piece of paper. Now we have technology and other mechanisms that kick off these processes. So, what is the intake to purchase requisition? Like, it is that purchase requisition form. The intake to purchase order usually kind of becomes through the purchase requisition. If you have a sourcing team, intake into sourcing is somebody get a holding of sourcing and saying, hey, I need help with this thing. So everything has intake that flows into it. My personal opinion about orchestration, it is sort of the workflow that ties all of those processes and intake together. Like, every one of these has its own intake, but you may come out of one of these processes and the next logical place is to be somewhere else. But instead, historically, sometimes we just dump a person out of process number one and they don't know where to go for process number two, and they're kind of stuck, right? So for me, orchestration needs to stitch all of that stuff together.
Yeah, I see it the same way, Conrad. I mean, intake is the front door, right, where the requests come through, and it's making sure that your user has all of the information that they need to process the request. So I see intake and the evolution of intake becoming this. Well, it's no longer a front door. Maybe it turns into this concierge. If we think about AI and what impact that might have on intake, where the procurement customer can go and get all the information they need on their request. Is it compliant with policy? Do existing suppliers already exist for this? What steps do they need to take? Who is involved in the approval process? So they can get all that information up front. And that's quite useful because sometimes it might change the nature of the request altogether if the user gets that information at the intake stage. But I agree that once it goes through intake, the next bit, well, orchestration is then all about the workflow automation. That's all I see it as, right? And you have a number of procurement processes, and it's about automating the connections between all these different process points, right, within your systems, and crucially giving visibility as well. So providing that transparency around where we are in that process, how long it's taking to execute a particular task or action. So I think both bits of technology are very promising, but obviously they do have their own challenges as well, which I'm sure we're going to dive into.
One of the things that I think is really confusing this space is this belief that orchestration is a skin that solves everything, right? A year ago, I was at a conference in Vegas and listened to a panel, and the feedback from procurement leaders was, I'll never go into, the user will never go back into all of these other underlying technologies in my tech stack. They're only going to interact with orchestration. I think that's what's in people's heads. Like there's just one layer. And I mentioned in part one of this that Google built this layer that insulates everybody from all of these underlying processes. I don't think that's a bad hope and dream with some of the technologies, but I just think there's a disconnect. I mean, you're talking about, hey, this is workflow that stitches things together. There is a perspective that it isn't just workflow, it's actually a user interface that hides everything from everybody else. And I think there's this pent up desire, like we need that thing in place. Do we? Like, does it make sense to replace all the user interfaces we've built and invested in?
Great. That's a great point. Do we need to replace, or can it sit on the top of the existing infrastructure? And will it complicate existing infrastructure or simplify? So let me give you a real life example, and you will walk me through how I can introduce an orchestration into my environment. If I have tool A to onboard suppliers, and then I have tool B for let's say, intake to start the process. And then I have tool C, where contracts are stored. And then tool D to pay the invoices. And then I have another tool, what's the next letter? E, that, for example, for diverse suppliers. And then I have another tool that gives me a dashboard. So maybe I have 7 or 8 systems in place, right, for different portion of my plan to pay process. We invested in each of them, right? Like each business invested in each of them. So do we let them sit? Do we replace them? Or do we put orchestration on the top as an umbrella? Or how, like, and what kind of thought process should go in the head of a procurement professional to analyze the situation and then determine, will orchestration help or will it hinder, or it's not the right time now?
For me, Natasha, as you're going through that, I just imagine myself, speaking to a client and they're walking me through their tech stack. And every single time they have this tool and that tool, I'm thinking, okay, another integration. Okay, another area where I need to deep dive, understand exactly how that tool works, how it's been set up, how it's integrated into your process, whether the data is aligned with all these other tools. So if I have one bit of supplier ID, is even the orchestration able to find that contract for that supplier? Do you see what I'm saying? So it's not so simple. It's not a skin. It doesn't work that way. I think you really need to be wary of all the integration challenges that you'll probably run into, right? Each one of these touch points needs to be studied. And I think even more importantly, procurement teams and procurement professionals need to take a step back way before they look into orchestration and really simplify the process and the data. And I know we always say this, always start with your operating model, always start with your process, but nobody does it, right? Everyone's still waiting for technology to come in and just wave a magic wand and fix everything. And it just never ever works that way, right? So my first sort of bit of advice is don't get too caught up in the hype or the promise that this will come in and solve everything. Do not underestimate the complexity that it will land you in.
I think you got to ask why are people wanting orchestration in the first place, right? What's happening in businesses is the business stakeholders and requesters are frustrated and pissed off that procurement's not working for them. Like, that's what's happening. Like, it's too confusing. Natasha's talked about a half a dozen different things I've got to understand and navigate. They're not well connected. And by the way, I need this stuff done in days, maybe a week or two. And procurement's telling me it's going to take a month or two because of all these things that are happening. Like, that's my user experience with procurement. It's a blend of the interface, the people, the technology, the time, and it just doesn't work anymore. So it's been escalated to the executives at the company saying procurement is slowing me down. I can't hit these projects. And so it's now coming back to the procurement leaders. And they're saying, hey, we got to do something different. They're looking for a magic wand, Zach, just like you're talking about, and a quick fix and a quick solution instead of doing the hard work of fixing the problems. Like, guaranteed, even, by the way, this idea that a skin on top of everything, which I think is nonsense personally, and I'll tell you why, but a skin on top of everything that doesn't address the time delays inside the process, the user's still going to be pissed because whatever it looks like, if they can't get it done in a few days or a few weeks, they know procurement is failing them because they can't get their project done. So really getting down in there and saying, what is failing? Why are we disappointing the customers? What are the things that we have to address? It may vary. I mean, we focus at Graphite on solving what I think is the biggest hairball time delay in the whole process, which is onboarding and risk management. Like, in my view, that's the 80% time problem, which is causing 90% of people's frustration right now. But I won't go down that path of why that's so important. But if you don't solve that problem and you put some skin on top of everything else, forget it. Not happy. Not happy.
Okay, so the first problem that orchestration is addressing is incoherence or user unfriendliness of procurement processes, right?
Yes, unhappy, but I would even put a bigger bucket saying their experience with procurement isn't meeting their business needs. Like, business needs something different from them, which could be it's confusing. It is confusing, by the way. And it could be that it takes too long. And guess what? It is taking too long. So what are these key things and how do you prioritize them and what's driving those problems in the process? I think, we talked last week about the Eloise spider diagram, right? And you look at that and go, oh my gosh, there's all this technology. I got to go stitch it all together. It's going to be impossible. I'm still of a fundamental mindset that is the systems that our end users need to interact with is a very few number of systems. I mean, do they need our spend analytics access? I don't think so. Do they need access to EcoVadis? I don't think so. Do they need access to some third-party supplier diversity data? I hope not. I hope we figure out how to bring those in such a way that the data shows up, the process shows up, that's easy for them. And that in itself shouldn't require orchestration. By the way, they've spent millions of dollars on Ariba or Coupa or one of these other tools, which they made a big decision, like we did. I'm talking they, but I did the same thing. Hey, let's pick the one that's most user-friendly. Let's pick the one that does all these things for us. And that is the core of their procurement tech stack. They bought it because it was good at the user, good at these things. And now we're talking as a function about like putting a skin on top of that because it sucks. And I think that's the wrong, for 10 different reasons, that's the wrong way to look at this problem.
Okay, so it can be bigger than I initially thought. So do you think that from the framework perspective of orchestration, is it on the path of replacing the full procurement suite, or is it still a function?
So, if you'll let me jump in here, Zach, and maybe Cole, you could kind of share the orchestration framework. I think it'll give some context here. Remember, people are coming at this problem thinking about a magic wand and a skin that's going to make procurement better, like across the board. And so they're coming in here thinking one layer solves everything really easy. Zach, at the beginning, you said, oh, all these integrations. That's what's really happening here, right? If you get inside of any workflow, whether you build this yourself, you buy orchestration, or you just draw it on a whiteboard, you're going to be faced with making some of these decisions. Somebody shows up at procurement. So we're going to start at the left and move to the right. Somebody shows up at procurement and says, hey, I need help with XYZ. Let's just say travel, and travel isn't part of your scope, and you redirect them where they should be. So there's this idea of just send the user where you want them to do this stuff directly. Like maybe you need to apply for a company corporate card, right? To do there's 100 reasons I'm going to send you somewhere else, and I'm not going to create an integration and everything else. So simplicity level is just redirect the user to the right place. Super low, like I would say this is low cost. It's easy. You can do it inside of a web page or any of the technology that we're talking about. And then you get to the next level of complexity is I'm going to send you there, but I'm going to send you with data. So imagine a process like, hey, I need to get a laptop. IT does that process in ServiceNow. I'm going to ask the 5 questions that IT is going to ask of you in ServiceNow, and I'm going to send that data over to ServiceNow. You're still going to have, and I'm going to tell you, by the way, guess what? I created this form for you in ServiceNow. The process has started, but you'll need to follow up with IT. You'll need to keep status. They'll send you an email. Like that other stuff is going to happen outside this environment that I did this for you in, right? So a simple redirect with data, so linking over with data. And then from that continuum all the way to a full integration. Like imagine now saying, oh, I'm not just going to send you to ServiceNow with 6 data points. I'm going to hide the fact that ServiceNow even exists. IT's doing their stuff in ServiceNow. You're just interacting with the IT process through the Graphite orchestration tool, right? And so you get this continuum of, well, do I show you the workflow that is sitting in ServiceNow? There's a whole bunch of stuff that might make that integration very complex and expensive. But still might make sense to do. So if you think about the 7 things or the 10 things or the 20 things that are happening in procurement that might fit inside your scope, you've got to make this decision. Is it going to be number 1, number 2, spanning up to number 10 that we're talking about here? Or in the end, it's just like, hey, they're doing it in ServiceNow. Maybe we ran it, one of our customers implemented a process in ServiceNow because they had nowhere else to do it. And it's easy enough just to take that process and put it inside of the orchestration tool because it's a simple form, a simple approval step, simple data. Just replace it, makes it easier for everyone. You don't have to have an integration. So that's kind of like beyond the integration is just a replace step. This is, and by the way, I've bounced this off of people that own orchestration solutions, like call them orchestration competitors in the market. And I have gotten verification that this is all accurate. Like what I'm showing you is true. What ends up happening when you get to a full integration is you have to mirror all of the forms, the data, the process inside this third box, fully hide. So if you come in and say, hey, let's create a skin on top of P2P, which, not throwing shade at anybody, but Zip came in the beginning and said, hey, I'm going to do orchestration. Their customer said, hey, Coupa licenses are really expensive. Why don't you create this thing that I don't have to do that? So create P2P. And so they did that inside this space. And by the time they were done, now they're like a P2P tool, right? You don't have to buy Coupa anymore underneath Zip. You can just use Zip, which is really cool, right? So now we have another P2P or suite solution in the space, but putting a skin on top of a very, very highly complex process is very expensive for the orchestration tool and for your team to make that work. So you got to make these decisions. There's no magic wand that's going to go, oh, all I do is pick the connectors and click, 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 it's done. No, there's a lot of cost and complexity to put these integrations in place.
I think there's still some value in the skin. I can see why a lot of procurement professionals are drawn to it because it does look very sleek. It looks sleeker than the old wave of tools that we had, right, with the integrated suites, etc. So it's benefited from that update, that refresh of kind of look and feel, and it looks more modern. But also, I think the skin gives you a little bit of that transparency around where you are in that process and at what stage you are in the process, right? So if it's stuck with IT for something, you know that this person in IT is responsible for it, and within the same sort of interface, you can message that individual, for example, to see where are we with this, when are you going to get it approved, etc. So I think there's a little bit of value, but I think the real value, Conrad, like you're saying, it's about whether it's going to do this, redirect with data, replace, or hide it, and I think that's definitely such an amazing framework for people to be thinking about it. Interestingly, from your diagram, I noticed the replace. I think the cost dropped when you're looking at replacing the tool, right?
Well, I don't know where to put that, right? Because the orchestration provider may actually go, you know what? We can do this less expensive. My cost as a procurement leader now, because previously I was paying for Coupa and orchestration to both be in this space. But once you just say, no, I'm not going to pay for both, I'm just going to pick one, which the orchestration tool is going to take over that space. In theory, it should save some sort of total cost for that to come down. But frankly, the orchestration tool, if they're trying to harvest revenue, they could easily just kind of keep the costs up there higher. So hard to say what happens from a cost perspective, and each of those processes will have a different implication there. But yeah, I would hope and expect that cost does come down when you're not doing a full skin mirror on top of a highly complex process.
Yeah. But for our listeners, it's integration complexity goes up, then so does the cost go up as you're implementing orchestration. Natasha, how do you feel?
I said it before, but I just want to highlight here. So imagine you've spent $2 or $3 million on Coupa. And then you're basically going to do this third step, very high complexity integration and cost on top of your Coupa investment. So I think as you implement orchestration, you're going to have to make a decision that so as part of this workflow management tool, am I going to redirect them over to Coupa, redirect them with some data because maybe I've been interacting with them, asking them some questions, or am I really going to try and skin on top of Coupa because I'm I'm so pissed off and frustrated with like maybe I arrive at a place I'm like, Coupa is just not easy to use, which I think is like, it's hogwash that that's the case. These tools have been working on, there's a lot of complexity in there, by the way, that can be streamlined still by Ariba and Coupa and, all these other tools that they need to continue to drive their experience. But underneath all of that is my belief that the users are complaining about the complexity. And Natasha said it, like, it's confusing, it's complex. I don't know how to run this process. It's true. It is. And because some of these, the user interface framework is like 10 years old, right? It's tabs, it's pages, it's tables. And you get into these new tools and it's more like a search bar. You ask a question and you're interacting with it in more of a form like modern AI kind of stuff. Of course, that's going to be more appealing to the end user.
And Coupa may yet roll that out. I'm pretty sure that probably all these integrated suites are working on that, that version of the release. So I think another bit of practical advice is, don't write off the integrated suites. They may yet come back with, just as good a user experience as some of these new tools that really had the benefit of, starting from scratch.
They're going to have to do it or they'll die, right? One way or another, they will lose out in their market share if they don't deliver a user interface experience that's competitive.
Zach, you wanted to say something like in a couple of minutes back? Still have that thought?
I've lost it probably.
Okay,
yeah.
Sorry, my fault.
So bring it home for me on a practical aspect. If I am a procurement director of a company, 1 billion in revenue, probably, let's say around 300 million in direct, indirect expense, probably have a PO system in place by now, have a procurement policy that probably have like around 50% compliance, have separate contract management system, probably have some travel policy, contingent workforce policy, but probably not fully enforceable. And they have each their own tool that provide that services. Should I think about orchestration? And if I should, what kind of questions I have to ask myself? Like, what should be my problem statement? Like, what have I take into consideration, Zach? Like, from your experience when you starting the conversation with various companies, what comes to, like, how would you consult me to approach it?
I would think of it in terms of two axes. So one is volume. So the volume of these requests that you're getting from the business, and also, like Conrad had in his chart, it'd be the complexity or the process complexity, right? So not so much integration complexity, but how complex the process is to run. And if I have 3 different touch points with 3 different teams, and I have a policy or maybe 3 policies, and then I also have questionnaires around risk, and basically, if the process is straightforward enough, so it's a category where the process is straightforward enough to buy what you want, and there's sufficient enough volume that makes sense that people will show up and want to be guided through it, right? And just want to be able to get what they want quickly. I think that's a great place to start. So it's really thinking about those categories that meet those kinds of criteria. Any sort of strategic spend, etc. I mean, sure, you can run it through orchestration and intake, but it's not gonna fix the core problems. You still need to go in and do the strategic reviews. You still need to do the risk assessments. You still need to do all of that stuff. So, okay, great. You have a fancy UI now telling you where you are in the process. Has that really delivered a huge amount of value? Whereas if it's low touch sort of spend management, right, where maybe users are not frequently engaged with procurement, aren't aware of all the policies, and also the process for getting what they want. Maybe it's like they need to comply with one policy, and it's a contract review by a junior category manager, for example. That's a great contender for intake and orchestration for me, right? And
so
like
orchestration helps with compliance, right?
It does help with compliance, yeah.
And orchestration
yeah.
helps with improving user experience, right?
Yeah, again, hopefully it would do that. Yeah. You'd think
Does
so, because I can see where I am in the process. Yeah.
Does orchestration help with effective spend management?
in so much as it can, are we talking about intake and orchestration, or is it like just purely the workflow automation part of it? Because that is not going to help spend
We're
management.
going to the beginning of the conversation.
Yeah, I think it does help. I think this is what we're trying to say is the real value comes back down to skills in procurement, your processes, your data, your policies. That's the hard work that you need to do, if you really want to, really drive value from your spend. The tools, I think, come second.
So the first thing you said, skills in procurement, it probably addresses maybe silent question that many of our listeners and viewers have, is that when orchestration becomes a reality of my everyday activity, does it mean that I am no longer needed? And I guess your answer to unasked question is that yes, absolutely, your skills will be needed more than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. Those skills don't go away. You just need to apply them differently. So instead of addressing one requisition at a time, right? You're actually looking at it from a more 30,000. Exactly. Yeah.
I just got to highlight. I mean, you mentioned, I think before, Zach, but orchestration isn't going to fix a bad process. So I don't care. Like Natasha, you mentioned $1 billion business. It could be a $20 billion business. I don't care what size the business is. Step number one is to sit down and map out the user's experience, the time, the technology, the tools, like map it out, do the day in the life, walk the freaking through the user's shoes, through the whole process. And in 5 minutes, you'll go, holy crap, I totally get why they're frustrated with us, because there's this problem, and this problem, which orchestration may or may not help. But fundamentally, if you don't know about it, the probability of addressing it with some new technology on top of it and stitching together, it isn't going to do it. And by the way, you could spend $1 million trying to solve this with orchestration and miss those important things. Like figure out the process, figure out the problems, and optimize it. Now, what problem are you really trying to solve? I mean, if you're really pissed off about your users are pissed off about their P2P user interface, maybe you've configured it wrong. Like you spent $2 or $3 million. Maybe you had a bad consultant do the implementation and it's got some problems. Like putting a layer on top of that is going to just make it even worse. So I think you really need to spend some deep thinking about what's the problem you're trying to solve.
Bad consultants. That never happens. Okay, I want to acknowledge one thing, that after procurement director highlights all the benefits that orchestration can bring in compliance, in process improvement, in better user experience, in greater spend management, and bring all these important components to their CFOs and CTOs. And it is possible that response will be, I hear you and I understand all the benefits it will bring, but on my list of priorities to invest or pay attention to, this is priority number 27 at best. All right. So there is not a magic pill that we have in our pocket that we can offer to every procurement person to say how it should be addressed and resolved. But I would like to offer on behalf of Conrad and Zach, sorry guys, I haven't consulted with you before on that, and I hope you'll forgive me later, that if you have the situation and you would like to brainstorm, feel free to reach out to either of us. We will be happy to participate in this conversation. Or better yet, if you have a particular problem, particular dilemma that you're trying to solve and you would like to brainstorm, let's bring it to the air. Let's have a discussion in one of our following episodes about a particular problem that you may be dealing with, and maybe engage the procurement crowd to provide their ideas and solutions. So I got
to interject. Sorry, I've got to interject.
Please.
I mean, one of the problems I have with like, it can do this and it can do this and it can do this and it can do this. This isn't like magic new technology that can do this for the first time. Like, the perpetual energy machine or something. No, you can, like, half of the time when people are not using a preferred supplier, it's because you're not telling them who the preferred suppliers are. And there are other methods to do that. And by the way, this might sound like I'm poo-pooing on orchestration. Not at all. I'm just saying that you have a lot of options to solve the problems that you have. Policy visibility. I'd be willing to bet $1,000 that if there's a policy enforcement problem, you probably have a policy content problem. It is so complicated, nobody can digest it. Like there's so many things that need to happen behind the scenes to accomplish the values that you're talking about, and you don't have to rely on orchestration to get there. And by the way, if you do and you don't solve those underlying problems, you're still going to have problems. So don't give up and don't worry about like this giant investment that I can't get the CFO to approve, because guess what? We all have that problem. It's really hard. I mean, if you're in this moment, you do have a magic time because there's enough complaints that the CFO is willing to invest. Don't spend that dollar unwisely, because if you go implement something and it still turns into shiz, like good luck on having a reputation at the business anymore after that. Like they're going to, okay, you said you can solve it. You go solve it. You still have underlying problems, swivel chair, unhappy customers. Like don't let that happen. This is a beautiful moment for you to take it and invest in what's going to truly help your business the most. Sorry, as you can tell, I'm just super passionate about this stuff.
No, don't apologize. And actually, you did not come across through this or previous conversation as pooping all over orchestration. In fact, the opposite. I feel that you sometimes are a bit too much pro it, right? And I keep thinking about low maturity of procurement organizations that I've been part of, and I'm trying to wear this hat, and I'm thinking about that shiny new technology. How do I apply it on the areas that still kind of like need to start walking and after crawling? And but also interesting point about compliance to the policy, because you said that if you have low compliance to the policy itself is probably a bit too scary for the end users. I remember in one of my organizations, or the companies that I worked for, my boss complimented me that I created 1.5 page long policy that represented multi-billion dollars of spend, because he said I expected to review a 160-page document. What he didn't know is that if he would click on every link that was in that 1.5 page, it would not yield to 160 pages, but probably 60 pages. But that actually is very important from the end user perspective, because if it takes 2-3 scrolls, they're willing to read it. If it takes more than 5, forget it, they will just drop it. So better yet for them to search for familiar words if they need that reference to travel policy, or they need to reference to contract approval policy, that they search for familiar words, click on that link, and then go and read that policy separately. So there is a possibility to create less than 2-page procurement policy and just make it filled with relevant references.
100%.
People do appreciate that.
What a great accomplishment to simplify that kind of stuff. Nobody reads it, nobody understands it, nobody can implement it. And by the way, when you go to implement orchestration, all of those logical variables inside the policy that you would try and workflow around, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Nuts.
Yeah. I think you're talking about the hard work, Natasha, that needs to be done. If you're writing a policy, I think the challenge a lot of procurement teams have is, how do you calibrate those thresholds, right? Contract value, risk level. Like these are the things that end up causing a lot of complication, that down the track. And to your point, I'm more interested in the promise of the intake solutions personally, right? Because they do address this issue of, I don't need to read a 200-page policy document. I could just ask the question, and in theory, I should just be able to get my answer, right? I think there's a huge amount of value in that. The orchestration side of it, the workflow automation side, is there value? Yes, absolutely. In that it's a nice looking skin, in that, there's visibility throughout an end-to-end process that you don't need to jump in and out of different tools. But for those orchestration tools to really be amazing, It's either they need to have a full P2P, S2P suite like we've been talking about, or have really easy out-of-the-box connectors, integrations. And even then, that doesn't solve your issue with your own data and your own, process nuances and intricacies, right?
So that takes us back to a debate about like suite versus best of breed, right? Because if the orchestration does all of that, then it's a suite, it's a Coupa, it's a Reba, it's Jagger, it's one of these tools, GEP.
Absolutely, yeah.
Brilliant. Zach, you touched on something that actually is a wonderful illustration of connection between procurement mind power and AI, right? So you, procurement mind, still have to create the policy. AI will help end users to find that right specific answer to a particular question you have without scrolling through multiple dozens of pages. Brilliant. So I think that brings us to the point of logical conclusion. So help me please summarize the madness of the last two episodes, right? So I think we clearly highlighted that orchestration is not a silver bullet. We still have to pay very, very close attention to the process, to user experience, and to understanding what problem we're solving for. That's the first step. Know what is the problem you're dealing with so you can find the right solution. Have a very clear understanding of the pain points your stakeholders, your end users are experiencing. Do not rely on technology solely. Pay very close attention to the process you have, and process includes policies and all of that. Pay attention to the skills of procurement team. Is there anything I'm missing that we want our viewers and listeners to take home?
I think you summarized it so well, Natasha. I just want to make that point around: do not underestimate the complexity of the integration. Should you go for orchestration, it's not an easy implementation, I don't think.
Well, and I'd just add start simple. Like you don't have to. This doesn't have to be some giant decision. Once you understand your problems, you can probably the 80-20 thing applies here. Create a front door, do a little bit of intake. Be more visible. Like starting simple is absolutely something that you can do here. And it will give you the learning to, starting with intake, as Zach is talking about, intake evolving into orchestration is not a giant leap, right? Because it will start highlighting for you where you're going to redirect, where you're going to redirect with data, and where you're going to try and build all these integrations.
Brilliant. Start simple, understand the problem you're solving for, pay attention to the process and policies. Do not underestimate the complexity of full-blown integration. That brings us to the first point: start simple.
Yeah, awesome.
Thank you so much for listening to us, for seeing us. We truly appreciate the ability to share our knowledge with you and hopefully engage in a dialogue with you directly sometime soon. Thank you, and let's make procurement rock and roll. We'll see you in a week. Bye.